Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to this RightCrowd webinar titled Cloud Clarity, Choosing the Best PIAM Deployment Model. Briefly introducing myself, my name is Bart van Sevenant. I'm the Chief Product and Technology Officer for RightCrowd, and I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Darren, for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Bart. Darren Bain. I'm one of the founders at RightCrowd from 21 years ago. Look after strategic initiatives here. So welcome, everybody. So still got a few people joining, but the agenda generally we're going to talk about today, we'll just give a brief background on the PIAM or PM or however you want to say it, our market. We'll then start talking about some of the deployment models, both historically and where we're heading, obviously, with the cloud. We're then going to really try and cover off some of the myths that we hear around the cloud. We're going to talk about cloud hosted versus cloud natives. There's a lot of cloud words that we're all dealing with. Bart is then going to provide a demo of the cloud native environment. We'll have a bit of a summary and then open it up for some questions. But please feel free to drop any questions in the chat as well as we go. So really, from a PM or PIAM perspective, you know, I started the business 21 years ago with some other people, and we started it in Australia, as you can probably tell from my accent. And we were out in the mines at the time, it was the early 2000s, and they had commodity boom going on. So there's a lot of money in gold and copper and all the other elements. And as a result, they were really trying to find ways to improve their business just by spending money to save money. And one of the things that they did, and they were pioneers, obviously, was that they wanted us to do a PIAM project. They definitely didn't call it that back in the day. But what they wanted us to do was to take the identities that were in SAP, which was their HR identity system at the time, and they wanted us to push those identities into their physical access control system, which we knew nothing about at the time. And they wanted us to do it intelligently. They wanted us not to just take a CSV dump, which it's still today quite often what we see, and it's an afterthought to get the physical access organized. They really wanted us to take an access management approach to pushing that identity in and making sure it became a physical identity. So they wanted us to get an approval for the person from SAP when they're hired or whatever to come to site, which was a very expensive exercise. And then they wanted to make sure they had the training before they got to site, because otherwise they were non-productive because you couldn't go on site with the training. So they wanted us to check the approval, check the training, and then populate them in physical access control. And that effectively is what physical identity and access management, or PIAM, really is. And that was the market that, we had an epiphany moment not long after that. It was like, well, we could really do something with this physical access side of the house, and we could really help to bring it and mature it in terms of its intelligence and all of the attributes that we can apply into that physical access, because we can use that physical access system to say, okay, you don't have training, you're not going to get access. You're picked for a drug and alcohol test, you're not going to get access. Oh, you've done that training course. Okay, well, we're going to grant you the access. But you need to automate those things, because when there's large workforces, it becomes a rather large administrative task to manage all of that. And that's not something you want security doing. So really, that's the story, the history of where RightCrowd started. And we spent the last 21 years really refining into the whole physical identity and access management market since. So given that background, Bart, we've got a diagram on the screen. How do you see the PIAM market?
Yeah, so let's maybe start with narrowing it down. What does it eventually mean? If you're going to adopt PIAM, what does it mean? You're going to put in place a piece of software called PIAM, and that piece of software is going to reside somewhere. And we will talk about the different models that exist. Is it going to sit in your data center? Is it going to sit in the cloud? And if it's in the cloud, what exact model is going to be used? But eventually, think of it as an intelligent piece of software that lives somewhere, and that then in turn connects what we refer to as northbound to these different business systems that you explained, Darren, and then southbound to one or more physical access control systems. And of course, that means integrations. That means making sure that you make those connections in a secure way. So what we'll do as we walk through the deployment options is explain how exactly that happens.
Yeah, so Bart, as I said, I've been doing it 21 years, and the majority of customers, of all of our customers, have been on premise, for many, many years, and it's been a long, long process to move into the cloud. So this is obviously interesting to talk about the differences between really what we're seeing from the on-premise and the customers who are moving to the cloud, and those that are coming in now and asking for cloud. So you want to take us through that, please?
Yeah, sure. So first would be good to briefly recap or explain like what does an on-premise deployment look like. So let's say that an organization has made a choice, like, yes, we want to implement this PIM product. They selected a vendor. In case of an on-prem, the first thing they're going to do is make sure that they put in place the underlying infrastructure, which is typically one or more servers, databases, all of that. So they most likely are going to work with their internal IT organization. That infrastructure is being put in place. Then, in most cases, two environments are going to be set up. One is referred to as a development or staging. The other one is a production environment. And then the actual installation is going to start. In many cases, when it's on-premise, the servers are going to sit in a data center. And that means it's not that straightforward for the PIM vendor to get into that environment and install it. So you have a quite complex sort of setup whereby the software needs to be provided to the customer. Very often through a remote session, the PIM vendor will help them to sort of install that software, and then that connectivity is basically taken away again. And so once the solution is then in place and up and running, what is typical for an on-premise deployment model is that from a roles and responsibility perspective, it now becomes the responsibility of the customer to make sure that they monitor that environment, but also that they manage that environment. And why is that? Very simply, the PIM vendor has no access to it. They cannot remote access to it. They cannot view that environment. So that burden sits with the end customer. They need to put monitoring in place to make sure is that environment up and running from the underlying hardware perspective, the operating system, and then the application as well. From a data point of view, of course, in this model, the on-premise model, the data sits with the customer, typically in the database, in the data center, or a private cloud type environment.
And
if we compare it,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, just before we do the comparison, I just want to point out what you just described, all of that, how do we do high availability? How do we do, what servers do we need? How big do they need to be? What's the database? Out of those 21 years, a lot of time has gone with the customer trying to get through all of those parts of the process just to get the install done. It's a big lift.
Yeah. And indeed, it can easily take 1 to 3, 4 months before all of that is in place and you can get going.
Correct.
If we do compare that to the cloud-based model, and I'm purposely not making distinction yet at this point in the webinar here between cloud hosted and cloud native. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But first, in terms of roles and responsibilities, there's a big difference here. In case of a cloud-based model, most of the things, if not everything, shifts to the PIM vendor. So making sure that the infrastructure is in place, the PIM vendor will work with one of the larger cloud providers. Think of a Microsoft, an Amazon, a Google, an Oracle, for providing all of that infrastructure. So as an end customer, you don't need to worry about that. They will make sure that the software gets deployed. We'll talk more about how that happens later on. And then they are also in charge of monitoring 24/7, the whole year round, and managing that environment. If there's upgrades available, new functionality, the PIM vendor will take care of that. Last point, and we'll talk more about data later on. Yes, from a data where the data resides perspective, in this case, a cloud-based, it's typically going to reside in a public cloud. But again, we'll talk more about what exactly that means.
And I got to tell you that now that we have these conversations at a cloud level, that it's one of the more complex areas. The whole high availability, failover, disaster recovery, like it's all been taken care of. It's incredible the difference once you get to the cloud. So just on that, let's talk about some of the myths that we have. And we're going to talk, you can see there, the key ones that we run across are around security, the data, as Bart just intimated, customizations, which we'll talk about and clarify, and also complexity and cost. So we're going to talk about those because, we've been at the heartbeat of this industry for 21 years. I said in the opening, 22 years ago, when we were out at that mine, we didn't even know what physical access control was, other than just like the rest of us, we used a badge to get in and out. Now, we realized the real value that lay in the physical access area. But for a lot of those years, and it's really only been the last few years that we've seen the shift to the cloud. Every RFP, every set of requirements, every inquiry from customers. Do you have cloud? What cloud options do you have? And it's completely shifted, but it took a long, long time to get here, but we're here. So on security, it's probably one of the big ones we get. Well, we're not going to the cloud. It's, there's no way security will ever go out there. So I can tell you, but I've talked and we've talked with many, many CIOs over the years, CISOs, whoever they are, and I wouldn't want their job when it's all on premise and they've got their own data centers and they're dealing with all these situations with, they're out to dinner on a Saturday night and someone hacks their system and then they're on the front page of the paper and things like that. Not a life I want to lead. So really, from moving to the cloud, but tell us, why is it more secure? Why can it be more secure for them?
Yeah. When we talk about like moving IT infrastructure to the cloud, the security aspect, I always break it down into two components. There's like the fact that you move into a cloud infrastructure. So that's where you go to those big cloud providers, the cloud data center providers, the Microsofts, the Oracles, the Googles, the Amazons, etc. At that level, I can tell you that those are the most secure facilities you can think of in the world. And that literally, that plays at the level of the infrastructure itself, the location, the physical access into those environments. But also when you look at the policies, the processes, the audits that is being put in place, all of the controls that are put in place, those are truly examples in our industry. You cannot like reach that same level of security as a private separate company. So that's one first important layer. So at the infrastructure layer, super secure, likely more secure than 99% of the other data centers out there. The second level is then, of course, the software itself. The application, in this case, we're talking about PIM. So if we deploy a PIM solution in the cloud, how can we be sure that that is going to be secure software? First of all, the security level of the application itself shouldn't matter whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. It should be designed with security at the foundation of the development. So any PIM vendor should develop their software based on best practices related to things like zero trust, which is the newer sort of way of thinking about how I secure an application. And that encompasses a whole range of things. It encompasses things like from an encryption perspective, make sure that the data is encrypted at all times when it travels. The fact that it's encrypted when it's stored in the database as well. Make sure that the connectivity into that environment is handled in a correct way, that you cannot simply, for example, directly get to the database. At the application level itself, make sure that you do vulnerability scans. OWASP is like a very well-known set of vulnerabilities at the application level. Make sure that those are tested again. So I would say overall, the combination of the cloud infrastructure and then good practice security at the application level, that combination makes something that is highly, highly secure. And I would say in 99% of the cases, more secure than anything you could do yourself.
You mentioned a few of the data elements there, but I mean, ultimately, we get asked about putting the data in the cloud and PII and GDPR and all these other things. But at the end of the day, the thing I always want to say to a customer is, well, you're using, say, Workday or PeopleSoft or whatever it is, your payroll data is up there in the cloud. All that data is up there in the cloud. So other industries have moved there. What are we doing? But what are we telling our CSO and CISO and security directors now, Bart, when we talk about this?
When we talk about the data itself, I first want to make one caveat. There are a number of organizations out there in the market that, because of regulatory reasons and compliance, they literally are sort of forbidden to move it into the cloud, and it has to sit in a particular data center. So I'm setting those aside. They're basically bound to having it into the data centers, their own data centers. But for the vast, vast majority of industries out there and organizations out there, they do have the choice between, do I put it in my own data center versus in the cloud? When we then look at the data, I think a couple of elements are important. First is like the geography. Where is the data going to reside? Because in the cloud model, indeed, it's not sitting in your premise, it's sitting somewhere else. And so with any cloud offering these days, you have and you should have control over where it geographically sits. If you are, for example, a company in Germany, and you want to have the guarantee that the data resides within the European Union, you can make that arrangement with your provider, your PIM vendor in this case, and you have the guarantee that the data from a physical location perspective resides in a particular region. So that's a very important component, like where does it sit? Second piece is that from a control perspective, you remain in control as a customer. So contractually, no one has the right to just go into the data, read that data, sell that data to someone else. All of that is like taken care of from a contractual perspective. So you remain in control. That includes deciding how long do I store certain data? What happens with data that I no longer need? How is it being purged? What happens with all of that? So as an end customer, you are still in full control of that data also when you move to the cloud.
Thanks, Bart. Customization, I don't even like to say that word, it's a dirty word, because the early PM solutions and really were, if they were customized to meet the requirements of the customer, and customer requirements in this space are very broad and very nuanced for their own organizations, it really painted it into a corner, because once it was customized, it was its own system, and it needs to be generic. So thinking about the fact that so many big customers, and that's who are doing this PIAM type deployment, they all have their own nuances. They have, I deal with government contracts, therefore I have export control issues, therefore this needs to happen in the workflow. But how are we allowing our customers to ensure that they can start with a solution and then configure it, not customize it, but configure it to their needs?
Yeah, you said it very well. PIM has a bit of a bad history of like really customizing custom code. Those days are gone. Today, PIM solutions are, as you say, configurable. So you can configure them to make sure that they fit your processes, your policies, and the like. And the thing, and that's the myth that we're alluding to here, there's still a bit of that misconception that on-premise software, I can do all of those configurations. When it's in the cloud, it's like off the shelf, I cannot do those same configurations. We want to be very clear there, that is not the case. You have the exact same ability to configure it to your specific needs in the cloud.
It's kind of lucky it took 21 years and 17 of those years to get to here, because we had to build a lot of infrastructure behind the scenes so that you could, do the things you need to do. Because at the end of the day, what's really important is that we don't go and write a special piece of code and plug it in for you, just for you, Mr. Customer, but all of this has to be upgradable, and it is upgradable with the way that we configure it, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, indeed.
Very good. Got that topic out of the way. That's a pet peeve. So migration complexity is the next one we want to talk about. And there's two types of migration that we're going to talk about today. One is just the whole getting a customer to migrate their thinking to the cloud. And this is obviously what this webinar is predominantly about. But also for customers who already have a PM deployment on-premise and need to then migrate as well. So thinking about all of that, Bart, what can you take us through what that journey kind of looks like for customers?
Yeah, I would say that in general, cloud deployments are way easier than on-premise deployments. And if you take the rollout of a PIM solution in our case, like at RightCrowd, when we say we are going to deploy a new environment in the cloud, that literally from a deployment timeline perspective, it is about 30 minutes. Compare that to the 3-4 months we spoke about when it's on-prem, given all of the work you need to get the infrastructure in place, getting approvals and stuff like that. So the way that literally works is you spin up a new environment, about 30 minutes, and then literally at that point, you can start to go and configure that solution, connect it up with your physical access control system, connect it up with these other business systems, start configuring the rules, the workflows, etc. So very straightforward, spin it up and start with your configuration. Your second scenario, Darren, is a slightly more complex. Like, what if I already have an existing PIM solution that sits on-prem and now I want to move to the cloud? The way that works is people often think like, oh, I need to lift and shift it to the cloud, etc. That's actually not how it occurs. The way that we do that is you first, similar to my first scenario, I spin up a new instance, I start the configuration, and then at some point, I'm going to do a data migration. So I'm going to say like in a particular, very often in a weekend, we're going to do the cutover. So we have a system in the cloud that basically has the exact same configurations. Everything's ready. We basically repoint users to it. and we migrate the data over so that the history is also residing in that new cloud environment we have. So quite straightforward and way less complex than people often think.
Correct. Now, speaking about not wanting to talk about things, cost. We always got to talk about money, but and that's in our lives as well. But look, at the end of the day, there's lots of other industries, and we're going to take a bit of a snapshot of that in a few minutes. But there's lots of industries who've crossed this chasm and realized that the costs of the cloud deployments versus what they think they're doing on premise, it seems disparate, but it actually turns out that the cloud turns out cheaper. So what can you give us insights into that, Bart?
People completely underestimate one aspect in this whole comparison, and it's scale. And just to put it into perspective, an organization, if you're a large organization, you're going to buy a couple of hundred servers a year. These cloud providers buy thousands of servers. So you can imagine the buy price that they have is much lower than that. If you have your own environment, you're going to have to monitor, manage it on a 24/7 basis. So you need to put in place an organization to do that. That cloud provider also needs that organization, but they can, instead of managing 100 or maybe 500 machines, they can manage thousands of machines with almost the same amount of staff. So you see where I'm getting at? It's like the cost per sort of compute element is way more beneficial at the cloud level. And one additional element, and we'll talk more about that when we go into the difference between cloud hosted and cloud native, is that when you run it yourself, you're going to buy compute equipment to cope with peak time. Like the worst time of the year, I'm going to have so many users using my application. So my infrastructure needs to be ready for that. And you're going to pay a big machine that for 80-90% of the time is idle. It never used that full capacity. In the cloud, not in every model, but in the smarter cloud models, you're going to be able to do that much more effectively and scale your infrastructure need up and down based on actual demand.
Yeah, I know we've seen a lot of situations with customers where there's like an annual renewal or something like that, and there's a peak time, there's a lot of compute needed and things like that, and it may run slowly. So then we have the painful conversation when they're on premise about, well, we need you to up your infrastructure, and then it's a whole conversation and cost they have to deal with. I mean, in the cloud, it's like the cloud recognizes we're reaching and it just expands, it scales, and then it drops back. So like you said, it's a much better model. So, do you want to start on this one, Bart, or do you want me to?
Sure. What we put together here is a graph that shows like what is the adoption of cloud versus on-prem for a variety of like IT applications that are out there used by enterprises. And if you look at it, there are certain pieces like at the very top, marketing automation. 90% of the marketing automation software used in large enterprises today is in the cloud. On-premise has gone down from, it used to be 100%, has gone down to 10% in just a matter of years. And you can see almost every single category in IT is now, majority of them run in the cloud versus on-prem. So that adoption has gone very quickly.
But where's physical access control in here? I'm not seeing it.
Good question, Darren. Physical access control is actually not in this graph. And why is that? Very simply, physical access control and physical security in general, I should say, is really a laggard when it comes to adopting the cloud. This has been a market that historically was 100% on-prem, is relatively conservative in terms of approach when it comes to the cloud. So yes, we're behind, but our expectation is that we will be catching up very quickly now.
I'm sure the audience can tell it was a loaded question, but and it's a reflection. Once we saw this, we were like, wow, and we knew inherently that was the situation. So,
yeah.
Bart, this is your area. I'll leave this with you to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we'll do now in the next section is make a distinction and explain the differences between two different models that are available in the cloud. Because people think like it's either on-prem or in the cloud, but hey, the cloud is not like this one thing. In reality, applications, and the same is true for PIAM applications, you have two different types. you have what is referred to as cloud-hosted applications, and you have what is referred to as cloud-native applications. And there's a lot of differences between both, and that's what we want to explain in this next section. Cloud-hosted is, think of it as I take the quote-unquote old model, I take what I have been running on-prem, I basically lift it, and I put it on top of a virtual resource, a virtual machine in the cloud. It's as simple as that. It's still the exact same monolithic application with a front end, some backend logic, and then a connection to a database. It's the exact same thing. If we compare it to cloud native is, think of developing an application, literally leveraging the new cloud technologies that we have available. So rather than a monolithic piece of software, I'm going to pull the application apart into all sorts of services. And each of those services, I'm going to optimize them. I'm going to optimize them from a compute resource perspective. I'm going to optimize them from a load perspective. And you really make the most out of what is out there. And if we drill in a bit more detail, like how does that translate into specific differences? If you look at cloud hosted, you're actually still going through a normal installation process. So I spin up a machine and now I'm going to do my installation, for example, a window install in it, and I go through all of that. Cloud native, completely different. Think of it as you have a pipeline with software, you push a button and it pushes that into it, like spins up all of the different containers or pods or whatever it is, and your software now is available there. If you want to do an upgrade, cloud hosted, you're going to go in, you download the new version, you do an install, it goes through all of its normal steps. In cloud native, an upgrade is almost seamless. It's like there's a little change in the software pipeline, it gets pushed down. It may be one container that needs an update or two containers, they're being updated on the fly, and now that new functionality becomes available to the user. So very, very different. Even more important is when we talk about resilience and scalability, night and day between the two models. In cloud hosted, is the exact same as the on-premise older model that we're familiar with. If you want high availability, that means spin up a second environment, another database, another application server, another sort of front end on top of that, and I have some sort of a load balancing between the two, and that's how I'm going to cope with potential failures at the hardware or the OS level. In cloud native, very different picture. You have almost this self-healing, self-scaling sort of environment where you can say, I have, instead of my big application, I have all of these components. For each component, I can say, I want to spin up 2 or 3 instances. If one of them fails, completely seamless, doesn't interrupt anything, automatically others take over, and a new one gets spun up. So it's like literally highly available by design. There's nothing you need to do. And if load increases, in the first scenario, cloud hosted, that means like, oh, I need to put more hardware in place or put additional stronger hardware in place. In the cloud native model, it auto detects there's a higher load and it will automatically spin up additional instances, those containers or pods that we spoke about.
Hopefully the audience can see it's just a much better model.
It absolutely is. And before I go into just quickly showing a couple of like what does that literally look like, a cloud native model, I do want to say one thing on the on-prem side, because as I mentioned, there are a number of enterprises where they're not allowed to move to the cloud, so they have to stick to the on-prem. The good news for those environments is that the benefits of those cloud native technologies that I just spoke about, they will gradually become available also for on-prem deployments. Like in the case of our own PIAM software at RightCrowd, if you upgrade to the latest version of our software in case of an on-prem, you actually get the exact same benefits, those containers, those self-healing pieces, etc., which we can deploy in an on-prem sort of scenario. Hence the title of this slide, like it's the end of the traditional on-prem, not saying it's the end of on-prem, but the way that it's being deployed is changing as well. And I think that's a good thing. Clients will benefit from those newer deployment techniques. So what I wanted to do next, and this is the exciting part of any webinar, is doing an actual demonstration. What I'm going to do now is show you what that like cloud native architecture really looks like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what happens behind the scenes of this little application component. So we have a PIM software, an end-to-end solution. One of the components of that software is what we refer to as an employee self-service application. So think of an employee in your organization wants to ask access to a new physical location, or they want to invite a visitor, or they want to ask a new badge or something like that. So this is what that application looks like for the end user. If we now switch to what that means behind the scenes. So what I'm looking at here, or what you're looking at here, is the following. I am connected not to a production environment. I cannot show actual customer data, of course, but to our internal development environment. And what we're looking at is our cloud native infrastructure running in Microsoft Azure. And I'm connected to one of our cloud clusters, as it's called. And you can see there's a whole bunch of applications running, application components. And so the one that we just looked at is this employee app. So that application that the end users are gonna see. In a normal or in an old model, what you would see is just 2 or 3 blocks, like here's the front end, here's the back end, here's the connection to the database. In this cloud native environment that we developed, you can see there's a whole bunch of different components available. And the interesting thing is that if we zoom in on, for example, the front end part or the back end part of that particular application, that you can see, and I know it's small, but these 2 blue boxes here are actually 2 instances of that same piece of the software. So by default, I have 2 components running here. And what happens, and we're gonna literally do this live here, if I say I'm gonna delete this particular instance of this employee application, so that's the same as saying the hardware fails or something goes wrong with the software, I can do a delete. It asks me, are you sure? Yes. And see what happens. It killed that first pod, as it's called, and it's now spinning up a new one. I don't have to do anything. This is all happening automatically. And in a matter of seconds, as you can see, we're back to 2 instances of that same application. From an end user perspective, there's no interruption whatsoever. All of the sessions are still running. And this is truly self-healing. It created a new second instance of that. In this case, there's 2 instances. If I look at what is referred to as the manifest, and I'm not going to go through all of the code here, but you can see that you define in software how many instances do you want of a particular component. If we look at the one that we just were looking at, you can see in this case, I declared that I want to have 2 replicas. If I want to change it to 3 or 5, that means that we're going to have that same piece of software running 3 or 5 times in parallel. So if 2 of them fail, no problem. They will self-heal, kill the one that failed, and bring up new ones. So quick demonstration of what that looks like, and I hope that sort of explains the benefits of those cloud-native technologies that we now have.
Thanks, Bart. We're running a bit over time, so we've noted a couple of questions in the background. We'll get those answered.
Yeah, I think we're where we wanted to get in terms of the webinar content here. So if I quickly summarize, there are different deployment options. There's on-prem, there's cloud, but then within cloud you have these important differences between is it cloud hosted versus cloud native. If you ask us, what should I pick? If you can move to the cloud, do it. It comes with so many benefits. And if you go to the cloud, then pick cloud native over cloud hosted because it has so many inherent benefits.
Thanks, Bart. Thanks, everyone. So we'll be posting this and make it available to you all. We've got a bit of background there on RightCrowd if you haven't heard of us before. That yellow location dot right down the bottom there in Australia, that's actually where, literally pointing to where we started the business at that site there. But we're happy to answer any other questions anyone has as well. I appreciate all your time today.